Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm just a couple of minutes late. I realized I was on mute for a few minutes. I hope you're all still with us. Today I'm going to get started in our webinar, NPS Best Practices Addressing Detractors. We have some awesome panelists and some awesome content for you, but I'm going to first just go over a couple of housekeeping items. The webinar will be recorded, and we'll send out the slides and recording after the webinar, so you can keep an eye on that in your inbox tomorrow. Also, we will have a Q&A at the end for our panelists. So if you have questions for the panelists or anything that we've covered, feel free to send those in the chat box or in the questions pane. And if you have any technical difficulties or questions that we can answer, you can send those in as well. So I'm going to be your moderator today. My name is Erica Childers, Content Marketing Manager here at UserIQ. UserIQ empowers SaaS companies to deliver what each user needs to be successful in every moment, starting with adoption. As a result, you'll be able to effectively scale onboarding, increase feature usage, accelerate time to value, and ultimately drive more revenue throughout the customer journey. Now I'm going to explain, give a little intro to each of our panelists. Our first panelist is Evan Klein, founder and president at Detractors Solutions. For more than 25 years, Evan has been an enthusiastic champion for voice of the customer driven change. He specializes in coaching business leaders on the customer and employee focused strategies that lead to increased profitability and sustained competitive advantages. Something I learned about Evan through working with him on this webinar is that in his early to mid 20s, he was someone who is sort of an anxious flyer. He didn't really enjoy commercial flying, but instead of letting that fear overcome him, he actually went out and learned how to fly and became a pilot, which I think is awesome. Evan, are you there?
I am. Thank you, Erica. How are you?
Hey, good. How are you?
Doing great. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. So the first question I wanted to just level set with each panelist before we dive into the rest of the content. Evan, what are some of the most common NPS cadences that you see in your work at Detractors?
So we work with a number of different organizations, and I think the most common cadence employed by most of our clients is semi-annual. They are inviting their customer contacts to participate in a net promoter or a customer survey twice per year. There are various flavors of that, but generally speaking, the view is that's held by us and many of our clients is annual is too long to go without a formal touch, and quarterly starts to fatigue starts to come into play.
Got it. That's great. Thanks for sharing. So our next panelist is Michael Madej. He is the Global Client Outcomes Manager at Gainsight. Michael currently serves as the Global Client Outcomes Manager, and as such, he partners with Gainsight's largest clients to deliver predictable outcomes and experiences for their clients and predictable growth for their businesses. He's become a trusted partner for his customers on use case and product functionality, and he delivers and communicates ROI for Gainsight clients throughout their life cycle. A fun fact about Michael is that he used to play hockey most of his life, but about 5 years ago, he had this really cool opportunity to join a local pro hockey team for like a 3-day contract and fill in for someone who is injured. He wasn't able to stay on the contract, but he said he had a great time. That's super cool. Mike, are you there?
I certainly am. Yes. Hey, Eric, how's it going?
Hey, good. Thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely.
So to level set again, Mike, can you tell us a little bit about what your NPS cadence looks like today at Gainsight?
Absolutely. We also look at the 6 month pattern for sending NPS. We do modify that slightly based off of implementation, where we will send the survey right after the implementation completes to understand how their process went. And so we've got that first one generally that happens around the 3 month mark. And then from there forward, we execute on a 6 month cadence.
Got it. Thank you for sharing, Michael. Our next panelist is Deborah Squire. She's the Chief Client Officer at Namely. As Namely's Chief Client Officer, Deborah is the voice of the client throughout the Namely company, infusing the client perspective in all decisions, processes, and strategies. She works across the teams or the company to ensure a holistic client experience and accelerate growth by driving a highly engaged client base through client advocacy and brand loyalty initiatives. Deborah, also, one thing I thought is cool about Deborah is that she travels more than 100,000 miles each year, which is super fun. I'm very jealous. And one time she was bitten by a zebra, which is not something many people can say. Hey, Deborah, are you there?
Yes, I am, Erica. My claim to fame being bit by a zebra at one time.
Yep, it's pretty cool. So again, to level set, Deborah, can you tell us a little bit about what the NPS cadence looks like for you at Namely?
Yeah, probably not a lot of surprises here based on what Evan and Michael shared, but we do a post-implementation survey with our clients once they go live, and then we survey our existing client base every 6 months, so semi-annually. We not only ask the NPS question, but we have a range of customer satisfaction questions across services, product, and process as well.
Got it. Sounds good. All right, now that you've gotten to know our panelists a little bit more, let's go ahead and jump into our content. So the first thing we wanted to cover was, what does your NPS follow-up strategy look like? And Deborah, I'm going to start with you on this one. Talk to us a little bit about what the follow-up strategy looks like at Namely.
Sure, Erica. One of the most important aspects of an NPS or a customer satisfaction survey program is the follow-up. So we strive to follow up with every single respondent within 48 hours of survey completion. We actually take a different approach depending on the survey feedback, whether they're a passive, a promoter, or a detractor. And we really dig into specifically what their concerns are so that we can come to that conversation with an action plan to help customers get to the right place. It's all handled through our client success managers.
Got it. That sounds good. So I love the idea of using playbooks. And I think, Evan, we're going to jump to you on this one, and you can talk a little bit more about this as well. Evan, what do you kind of recommend is a good NPS follow-up strategy for some of the clients that you work with?
Yeah, the strategy is similar to what Deborah just mentioned, in that, especially around detractors, to try to get to them and initiate dialogue within 48 or 72 hours of their response to the survey. With passives and promoters, we generally advocate to our clients that they have a little bit more time. It doesn't have to be the same sense of urgency. Maybe in some cases, passives may have some significant concerns that you'd want to address quickly, but you have a little bit more time there. We do develop playbooks for our clients, which guide them on these best practices. And the only other thing I'll note is that non-responders are actually a group that should be followed up with as well. Many companies overlook that fact, and in some circles, non-responders are to some degree considered detractors, although we certainly don't consider them that from the formula and calculation of your Net Promoter Score. There are some reasons for concern if your accounts are silent and are not responding to your survey. So we recommend to our clients that they formulate a follow-up plan with especially high-value non-responders as well.
That's great. And I love this closed loop kind of script example that you shared. Everyone on the call, we'll send this in our follow-up email so you have a little longer to look at it. But I think this is really interesting in kind of making sure that you're closing the loop on that feedback. Once you've gotten that feedback from your detractors, what do you do with it? And I think some of these playbooks are really great. This is one example that we got from Evan.
Yeah, the important point here, Erica, is that when you're conducting your closed loop follow-up, what a customer does not want to get from their, from the companies that they're working with is essentially someone who's asking largely the same questions that they already answered in the survey. So you have to be thoughtful about how you approach this. You're looking to glean greater insight, to drill down a little bit deeper, understand maybe the root cause of their frustration. Don't just simply go ahead and ask them the same things that they already answered. That might frustrate them even more.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Evan. So Mike, I'm going to move on to you on this one. What does the NPS follow-up strategy look like at Gainsight?
Sure. So the first thing is for all respondents, we have our sales leaders, product leaders, technology leaders, and customer success leaders all receive an email in as close to real time as possible, letting them know about the new survey. Something else that we actually just recently incorporated is we have an integration with Slack. And when a respondent comes in, we actually have a Slack channel that's dedicated to NPS responses, and the CSM on the account is notified. So we're really hitting it internally from a few different angles to make sure that we have eyes on that response. As the other folks mentioned, when it comes to actually reaching back out to the customers, we do have slightly different cadences based on the response. We do have a little bit more time to reach out to promoters, but detractors, we really want to close that loop on in 24 to 48 hours. Ideally, we get the detractors and passives on the phone. We find that it gives them a little bit, it gives them an ability to communicate their challenges a little bit more fully than it would be through an email. And then also something interesting that I think we do that more folks could and should be doing is when you receive a promoter score, actually ask that person to do some promoting for you. Something that we at Gainsight do is if someone responds with a 9 or a 10, we will in turn then ask them if they would be willing to advocate for us through a third-party tool like G2 Crowd or Trust Radius, or if they'd be willing to participate in a marketing endeavor such as a white paper or a video. I think so oftentimes we have customers who say that they're willing to be advocates for our brand, but then we don't follow up and actually take advantage of that. So that's something that we do at Gainsight every single time, and something that I would strongly suggest to everyone who's on the call today.
I think that's a really great point. We definitely want to talk about, how we follow up with our detractors and make sure that we're getting to them quickly and answering their questions. But, there are other people in our NPS outreach, and certainly our advocates are great opportunities for us to reach out and get those testimonials. Being in marketing, I know how difficult that can be. So, if we have a starting place for that with our NPS follow-ups, that's definitely helpful for everybody. Thanks, Mike. So some things that Mike touched on earlier a little bit were kind of how some of these insights are distributed across the organization. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Evan, I'd love to start with you on this one. How do you make NPS visible across organizations that you work with?
Yeah, it's an important question because, look, we're gathering rich and actionable insights and to really empower the organization to leverage them and have the most impact on your customer experience program. They have to be socialized, they have to be circulated, they have to be made available in a relevant and meaningful fashion to all the people who can make decisions based on these insights. So, sharing them in various forms. First of all, many of our clients have visibility into survey responses and closed loop follow-up activities in their Salesforce or CRM install. So first and foremost, making sure that the right people have exposure to that, but also, some analysis and interpretation needs to be done, preferably objective analysis, and with findings and recommendations based on the aggregation of the data, the themes and patterns that are found. And what we do for our clients is prepare those analyses with visualizations and share them with different stakeholders inside the organization. So many of you can do that in-house, just ensure that it's unbiased and objective data that you're delivering, but make sure that it's shared in as much of a real-time basis as possible, so the people in positions of authority can really grasp how they should leverage these insights to inform their decision-making and prioritize.
I think that's great, Evan. I definitely think that's something we don't talk enough about is, the survey data is great and it's very actionable, great rich data, but how does tracking, how we interact with those people, how is tracking, how we make sure that we're following up with those people important just as well. So I think that's great. Deborah, I wanted to move on to you for this one. You had talked about earlier that there's some deep dives that your company does into feedback that every colleague in your company receives when an NPS happens. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of our values at Namely is making our clients heroes. So part of my responsibility is to create this culture of client obsession. And in order to do that, every single colleague across the company needs to understand intimately what the client experience is and how they can have an impact on that. So following every survey cycle, we actually prepare different and tailored presentations to different groups across the company, starting with the executive team and working all across every department in the company. So a tangible example that I'm sure many people can relate to is, looking at the feedback at in a very focused way across segments, industries, company size, and other attributes that can help inform marketing to those clients or those prospects who have the best chance of success, and also inform how we position our product and features. So we focus, heavily, for example, with the marketing and sales team on clients who tend to be successful with Namely and what those attributes are, as well as some of the pain points that clients that don't fit into that criteria experience, so that they're better informed about how to drive the right demand and then how to close the right opportunities so that customers can ultimately be successful over the long term.
I love that. I think definitely, sharing this information across your company is so important, especially when you're thinking about maybe your customer journey mapping, or maybe you're thinking about how to improve your product, not just looking at, that from a customer success or product perspective, but making sure that everyone is aware intimately on, what those things look like and what a successful customer is for Namely. I think that's great.
Erica, if I could for a moment just add something to this. Net Promoter, because of its simplicity and its ease of explaining to the organization what a promoter, passive, and detractor are, one of the greatest benefits of Net Promoter adoption is the impact or potential impact it has on your culture. And Deborah certainly touched on this, but I think a lot of companies, unfortunately, miss out on the opportunity to really help drive culture around customer centricity and a leading customer experience with their Net Promoter program. And so that's something that, again, Deborah touched on, but that we emphasize quite a bit with our clients is leveraging these insights to call out employees, to tie potentially and carefully with variable comp programs, or at least spot awards, and to really make it a source of discussion and conversation year round, so that people recognize the importance, and it's an ongoing focus across the organization with every employee.
I love it. That's a great ad, Evan. Mike, let's move on to you for this one. Talk to us a little bit about, you explained earlier how, this is shared in real-time alerts across the leadership at Gainsight. Can you tell us any more about that and what that looks like?
Yeah, certainly. So as I mentioned, between both the Slack communication and the email, and then it's a really collaborative process of our leadership team at the highest level of our C-levels, but then also the managers within the departments. And it's really great to see, particularly within Slack. And as I mentioned, this is a new feature that we've rolled out recently. But you will see communication to product teams if a person responds about a certain feature or function, and we'll pull in the engineers who work on that segment of the platform, and dialogue will start. So it's really interesting to see in real time how a survey response comes in, and immediately teams jump to action and start collecting insights and collaborating on what we receive back. Also something, and I think both of the other folks touched on this, is it's critically important that all levels of your organization are bought in to engaging with your customers. I know personally that our CEO, Nick Mehta, reads through every single one of these responses. And I know he kind of feels the pain when we receive a bad score and wants to know what we can do about it. But then he's also very quick to recognize the CSM or the salesperson who's called out with a great score. So for us, it really starts at the top, and the importance is emphasized there, and then it trickles down to every last employee.
I think that's fantastic. And to Evan's point earlier and how that impacts what your culture looks like, not just, what it looks like to make sure that you're responding correctly to your customers, but how that impacts your culture and each employee, I think is so powerful. Thanks, Mike. All right, as a reminder for everyone, before we jump into our next question, if you have questions for our panelists, feel free to chat those to the organizer or send them in through the questions pane. And we'll be delighted to answer those in the Q&A coming up. All right, moving into our next question. What is the best way to engage with detractors? And Mike, I'm going to start with you on this one. Once you've run an NPS survey, what are some of the things that you've seen be really successful in how you respond to those?
Absolutely. I think the most important factor before you jump in and try to reach out to the customer is understanding who that user is. Are they a decision maker or a buyer? Are they an end user? What features or functions of your platform have they leveraged or not leveraged? And this will help you to kind of create your strategy of how you want to have that interaction go. I never want to jump on a call with a customer who's submitted a negative score without really doing my research to understand a little bit more around why they gave this, what habits or behaviors have they executed on that may have led them to give us this score. And then, as we discussed earlier, the phone call is always the best way to do it. It allows for the most amount of collaboration and understanding between you and the customer. Another kind of cool thing that we do, and something that I found to be pretty effective, if we're having challenges, our platform actually allows us to send a quick video over to the individual who submitted the survey, and humanizing yourself and kind of making yourself personable will kind of give them a little bit more skin in the game to respond to you. Okay, this person took the time to create this little snippet of a video specifically for me. Obviously, they're really invested in what I have to say. Maybe I'll shoot them a note back. And then if all of those things fail, we have an escalation process internally where I can push that up the ladder to my leader or to our vice president. And sometimes you need to do that if the person really kind of wants to have a title match. So if I'm a client outcomes manager and I'm trying to reach out to a vice president or an SVP, they may not respond. But if I match titles to them, and that gives me a little bit more likelihood to have them call us back.
I think that's a really interesting strategy, Mike. And not only, I think humanization is something that we're all focused on right now. It's a big buzzword, but I think it's really important in how we do business. And I think doing these little things through video and making sure that you're matching people with the right person, I think is really intelligent and really smart to make sure that people are, if they're giving whatever score that they're giving, that their feedback is being received and acted upon, and closing that loop. That's awesome. All right, Deborah. So what are some of the most common ways that you've seen be successful when engaging with detractors after you've run your NPS survey at Namely?
Yeah, I think to follow on what Mike just shared, it's really important to make this a very thoughtful process. And it's a good rule of thumb in any client interaction to come to the party knowing everything that you can know about their experience. So not only reading through the survey response, but also understanding what modules they use, having a bit of background on their overall experience. Anything that you have access to that you can learn about that client in advance of a conversation is really critical, because you should spend the time engaging with them on an action plan to get them to a better place, not asking questions that you can answer through your own research. It's also really critically important from my perspective to humanize the process. Just as Mike mentioned, I think there's a tendency in SaaS to think it's technology, and so there's not a human aspect to it. So anytime you can meet with a customer face-to-face, it's ideal. If you can't do it face-to-face because of logistical challenges or otherwise, then using video chats, a Zoom meeting where you're using video and really personalizing that experience. And then ultimately, I find it's best with detractors to really in understanding their experience, bring to the conversation people who need to hear firsthand what the customer experience is and who can contribute to making that better over the long term. So if the client is having issues or pain points specific to product features or product usability, bringing in the appropriate product manager to hear that feedback directly and also to help support them through action plans to get to a better place is always helpful. If the feedback is around the sales process and what they expected versus what they were delivered, then I bring in a sales leader who can hear that firsthand, because we use those individual circumstances not only to solve that particular client's issue, but also to take back and ensure that we're taking every step to avoid that from coming up again in the future for other customers.
I think that's great. Obviously, very smart to make sure that you're applying what you're learning from one customer to all of your other customers. But I love your point about how we can kind of get a little lost in SaaS about making sure that we're talking to humans. We think it's technology, so we got to use technology. And I love the idea that we're focusing more on providing that human touch. I think that's fantastic. Evan, let's move over to you on this one. What are some ways that you've seen companies be successful in when engaging with detractors?
Yeah, very good. And I'll say Deborah and Mike covered most of it, but a few things I'll add here. And one nit on the slide that you're showing here, Erica, is that if you're waiting until after the survey, then you've waited too long, right? So what we strongly advocate to our clients, as we were referring to earlier, as playbooks, is to create those playbooks well before you field your survey, so that while your survey is in the field and while responses are coming in, and in some cases detractors are coming in, you're able to address them in near real time. So those playbooks are developed sometime a month or more out, and they effectively, think about a process chart. They effectively look like, how many resources do we have, who's going to be involved, when are we going to get so-and-so involved in the closed loop versus someone else. And Deborah touched on whether you might need a product person on the phone or a service person or customer success person. So knowing what your available resources are and who is adept and skilled at navigating these conversations is of great importance. And then being ready to go once the survey is in the field. And the other point I'll make is, another form of closing the loop. Of course, you can do it in person, you can do it in video, you can do it electronically, you can do it on the phone. One thing that we strongly recommend for is ahead of the next survey wave is an advance notice communication, saying essentially, hey, our survey is going to launch tomorrow or in a few days from now, but we want to bring you up to speed on some of the actions we've taken based on your feedback to the prior survey. So that demonstrates very clearly that you're thinking about their input and you're taking the appropriate action. So you list 3 or 4 bullets at a relatively high level that all of your customers will see, and show them that you're doing something with their feedback. So that's another form of closing the loop, because you're demonstrating clearly that action's been taken, and it can be additive to some of the other strategies that have already been touched on.
Thanks, Evan. That's really important. I think closing the loop is obviously something some of us kind of forget to do. We may take this feedback and we use it, and we kind of just hope that not only that customer will see it, but that other people will see it. But I think if we're kind of clearly laying these things out to show people, here's what we've done, we appreciate your feedback and we're acting on it, is really powerful from the user and the customer's perspective. All right, so I'm going to move into our next question. I wanted to give a chance for each of our panelists to kind of talk about a time when NPS responses actually helped shape the brand. That was a big part of the topic that we wanted to cover. We know NPS is hard, and getting detractors is always such a bummer, but we think that having these detractors can kind of help shape your brand, as we've talked about, close the loop, improve what your product looks like or your processes. So I wanted to start with Mike. I wanted to start with you on this one. I wanted to start with Deborah on this one. Can you talk to us a little bit about some stories that you can share and ways that you've seen NPS responses impact the brand as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, earlier I shared how we use the NPS feedback and detractors versus promoters to identify what the ideal target market and demographic is for new business coming in, so that we set our marketing and sales team up for success, and that long term we have more promoters and greater client success. Another area that was impacted by feedback that came in over the course of a couple of surveys was the type of customer service training that we provide to our support colleagues, we identified an opportunity to help build out the skill set of our support team as it related to managing and calming through escalations that came in, and really providing them with the tools and resources that they needed to feel confident handling an upset client and getting them to de-escalate. So that really changed the approach that we took to training our existing colleagues, and we built that also into our new hire training as part of our core curriculum for every hire that came into the customer success organization, whether they're support or success enablement or other roles in the process. But what I will say is it can be daunting when you're dealing with the volume of responses coming in during the survey cycle. And it can also be daunting when you think about, reading through and looking at and actioning all the feedback from your detractors. But what I found is that if you really dedicate yourself to that follow-up, that you can definitely see the ROI out of this program just in reducing customer churn. So, I really map out which clients we're able to save as a result of these interventions that we would not have been aware of otherwise. And I use that to continue to feed into our investment into these programs.
I love that. Talking about ROI, the ROI on NPS and kind of how it can impact. As a follow-up, Deborah, real quick, how has being able to show this ROI sort of helped you either get or keep the buy-in from executives on this impact from NPS?
Yeah, well, with the executive team and particularly with the CFO, you have to actually show the bottom line impact. And so I do it in two ways with these programs. One is with regard to retaining the detractors and taking those detractors, to a place where they are renewing. So the impact is on reducing churn and showing that we've retained more revenue generally several times over than it costs us to run these programs becomes really critical to ensuring the funding year over year. The other thing that I do, though, because detractors are one piece of it, but you've also got your promoters that if you nurture and build an advocacy program around those promoters, then you're driving more referrals and more into the top line. So really quantifying the impact on both sides becomes critical. And then from one survey to the next, really tracking those that went from detractor to passive and passive to promoter so that you're continuing to feed that virtuous cycle.
Love it. That's a really powerful way to think about NPS and the ROI it has. Evan, let's move on to you for this one. You talked to me about a couple of different methods that your team takes in looking about this or looking at this. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we're thinking about the brand and the brand promise, including a commitment to service excellence as a means to differentiate your company from the competition, and I assume if you're on this call, that's got to be part of it, then all of the activities, diligently following all of these recommendations is really going to help your brand, right? Because we're talking about a commitment to listening and acting. And so I think the more companies that are really walking the walk as it relates to the customer experience programs, that certainly will help your brand. On the other side of it, what can tarnish your brand are detractors who speak negatively about you in the public domain, right? Those who complain about you in a public forum. And addressing those detractors by, fixing their concerns or ultimately getting them to a happier place will reduce the number of people who might be weighing on your image and your brand in the public domain. So that's something that is of great importance. Of course, there are some clients, interestingly, of ours that, based on feedback from their survey and detractors, have decided that maybe they're not a good fit for the organization. And instead of retaining customers that are unhappy, they decide to part ways with them amicably to the extent that they can. And so those folks are not out there on a regular basis speaking negatively about your organization. So those are things that certainly can have a positive impact on your brand. I think, we also see a lot of examples of companies that, are just really committed to, taking the appropriate actions around these endeavors. And one of the greatest sort of versions of comments that we read from a survey from one of our clients, or when their customers are saying, hey, we really appreciate that you've addressed our concerns. You've fixed our problem. Things are getting better. You truly listen. And that obviously is a wonderful point of feedback that we see a lot when our clients are doing the right thing and diligently following these recommendations.
Yeah, that's great. I love to hear that kind of feedback for you. Mike, so we had talked earlier about some different ways that you've seen this happen, and we talked a little bit about a previous life that you had, not in hockey, but maybe somewhere else, and that you had found that you were kind of struggling with communicating product updates and how that shaped what your product and processes look like. Mike, can you talk a little bit more about that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And what we were finding when in either reading through the comments or looking at the scores or having conversations with respondents, we found that they were consistently asking us for features and functions that we already had in our product suite. And kind of rather than just throwing up our hands and blaming the users, we really doubled down on communicating more effectively with them. This led to us providing in-app messaging when it came to updates or to features or functions that were a little bit more complex. We kind of walked the user through the steps rather than just expecting that they would know intuitively how to use it. This immediately led to a spike in our CSAT scores, which was great. It also actually led to a reduction in the total volume of kind of questions around features and functions that were coming into support. So our scores went up, the volume of tickets went down. So we were really deflecting cases, which was a positive thing. It also caused our organization to really realize that we had to focus on UX and UI. That we had pushed these offerings out, and we thought that they were usable, but in reality, they weren't. So we focused on UX UI. We introduced the in-app messaging, and then we also worked out and built a very robust community where users could self-serve and answer their own questions without having to reach out to a CSM or open a support ticket. And that also really helps the usability of our platform. And then finally, the other area that I really saw improvement is that we used NPS as a main driver for our discovery backlog. So there weren't, of course, questions that came in around existing features and functions, but there were others where people were asking for something that we weren't doing. And we really used that. Use those ideas and those concepts that we were receiving from our customers to form the basis of our discovery backlog. And then we kept those users in the loop as we innovated around the ideas that they submitted, and then finally communicated back to them, hey, you asked for this feature or function, here it is. Thank you so much for being part of our community. So those are some really great ways that we saw our organization really rally around the findings from NPS.
I think that's great. I think that's definitely something so many of us can resonate with, is maybe we're not saying things in the right way, but we're getting feedback, and how we address it is so powerful. So before we jump into Q&A, I wanted to cover one last thing. So as we're all thinking about what the end of the year reflections look like and how we're planning for next year, I wanted to get feedback from each of you on some areas that of NPS that your organization is looking to improve upon it next year. And Deborah, I'd like to start with you on this one.
Sure. I mean, I think this is not necessarily an improvement so much as just a modification based on the growth of our business. We're looking at breaking customers down into cohorts and still staying on that semi-annual cycle, but actually cycling through them at different times. Our business grows very rapidly, so we bring on hundreds of customers per quarter, and getting in front of them more quickly to gather input, just puts us in a position of power to actually action that feedback more quickly at that client level. So that's one thing that we're considering for next year.
I love it. Evan, let's move on to you with this one. What are some ways that you're kind of, I guess, convincing your clients to look to improve upon in NPS next year?
Yeah, I'll offer three, because it's interesting, when companies come to us potentially exploring a partnership with Satric Solutions, many of them still are struggling with, generating good, reliable, representative, and trustworthy data. across their survey programs, Net Promoter or otherwise. And so for a lot of companies, it's really just focusing on generating higher response rates, having a strong methodology, and making sure you're getting reliable and trustworthy data that informs the recommendations and the findings that your leadership team will see. So, that to some degree is earlier stage maturity level for some companies, but it's quite a prevalent challenge that many are facing we find, come to us and ask for assistance. If you're further along, I think, sort of the holy grail, and Deborah touched on this, as they're relatively sophisticated over it, namely, is really tying the results of the efforts around your Net Promoter with business results. Either a churn reduction or revenue or profitability improvements or, customer lifetime value. And so a lot of companies are really working towards that to get better at being able to tie the two together and get even a little bit predictive. If I start to see these things happening, this account may be at risk. So there's a lot of sort of statistical analysis and a lot of data inputs that are needed there. But that certainly is an interesting focus for a number of companies going forward into next year.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Mike, what about you? What are some ways that Gainsight's looking to improve NPS in the coming year?
Yeah, I think we are going to really start looking at our customer segment. Being a kind of basically a large startup, we've more or less treated all of our customers the same way. And I think as we grow, as we bring on more customers, we're going to have to start to segment. And NPS is a place that we can look and identify kind of overserved markets where we're doing very well and we really understand the use case, and then other industries or sectors that we're not serving as well. And to Evan's point, earlier, it may end up that we find some things where we say maybe we shouldn't necessarily be doing business with this type of customer or this segment of customer. So I think NPS is really going to help us stratify our customer base and understand where we should be working and maybe where we should take the gas off a little bit. And then secondarily is just pushing that advocacy piece, like I mentioned earlier. I think we do a pretty good job of it. We do it, first of all, which, reaching out and asking people to be advocates once they said they're willing to be. I think that's a good start. We just need to be, I think, a little bit more, not necessarily forceful, but steadfast in it and continue to follow up and without ever alienating the customer, but really making sure that we see that to the end. So segmentation and then really leaning in on that advocacy piece are the two areas that we're going to focus on in 2019.
Awesome.
Erica, sorry to step on you there. There's one other thing I wanted to share, and it ties back to the discussion that we had of culture building. And frankly, bears repeating because it is so important. A lot of companies that we're talking to are also looking to expand their Net Promoter internally, either using employee Net Promoter, right, to gauge how likely your employees would feel about recommending your company as a place to work, because there is a strong connection between employee engagement and customer satisfaction and loyalty. And then also trying to assess where your team members and how they're serving internal customers. A lot of companies talk about, hey, we want to be exceptional with our external customers, but then they fail to support each other internally. And they don't communicate well, or there are breakdowns between departments, which obviously affect the customer experience. So our clients are also looking for ways to measure the success of that internal customer service element going into next year as well.
That's a really good point. Definitely not something that we were thinking about, or not necessarily the topic for the webinar, but as we're thinking about how NPS can impact culture, thinking about those employee and internal side NPS surveys, I think is definitely important. All right. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. Feel free to send them in for the next few minutes as we continue going over them. But one I thought was really interesting, and we actually had talked about this previously, was how do you determine the benchmarks that you should be focused on for NPS and your response rates? And Evan, because we had talked about this earlier, I'm going to shoot this over to you. What are your thoughts on how you benchmark yourself for NPS?
Yeah, a good question and a difficult one, right? And it is a common one that we get, and we understand, the desire, especially among many leadership teams, to have that perspective, that context. How do we compare to others who sort of look like us? And what we advise them is, frankly, don't try that hard, because it is very, very difficult to obtain benchmarks that are reliable and truly comparative. Because you never know what methodology other companies are using or how they stack up with regard to your business from a product or a service model perspective. So it's almost an exercise in futility. With all that said, we do have perspective. We work across a large number of companies that are broadly fall in similar industries, so we are able to offer our clients some context around that usually satisfy them. But trying to gain visibility into the net promoter scores of your competitors is usually a heavy lift and frankly can be quite expensive. What I would say is benchmark against yourself is first and foremost. So establish your baseline and then use a consistent methodology and then track your performance over time. That's first and foremost. Benchmark and track your response rates. You should be achieving very high response rates that generate reliable and trustworthy data. So you really focus inward as much as you can on that, as much as you can convince your leadership team to focus on that.
Great, thanks, Evan. We had another question come in from Amanda, and Amanda was asking about how you get your executive buy-in, or how you get your executives and your board to buy into your NPS program as a driver of change. And we talked a little bit about this with you, Deborah, earlier about how you can prove the ROI and kind of use that as a way to get buy-in. But Mike, I wanted to shoot this one over your way and see if you have any additional thoughts or things that you would share from your experience.
Yeah, I think that is definitely the key, is understanding that there is a financial impact to ROI. And something that we were able to do as our program matured is we were able to track basically what the cost of a detractor was to us. We were able to understand a detractor is X% more likely not to renew. And so when we received those responses and there were the negative scores, we knew what that impact was, and we knew the impact it would potentially have on renewals and impact to the bottom line. So rallying the entire organization around that and having them realize here are the dollars that are associated with individuals or companies who are detractors and are apt to leave us is this large number of dollars. And when you equate a dollar value to detractors, it all of a sudden really wakes everyone up and makes them understand this is something we've really got to work on, because if we don't turn these people around, we are at risk of losing X% of our business. So really taking the NPS numbers, specifically the detractors and also non-respondents, as was mentioned earlier, because oftentimes they are more than likely going to be detractors, and really trying to equate that to a dollar value, and then measuring that against your bottom line is critically important, and it will get your C-levels and your executives bought into your program.
Yeah, and I would say it's 100% agree with Mike on that. What's been interesting trend and a welcome trend over the past 5 years or so is how often venture capital and private equity firms are actually telling their portfolio companies, you need to do this. We want you, measuring net promoter score as a key performance indicator, and their focus across the investors who obviously sit on the board. It's a lot of the time it's coming from them, because they recognize that companies who have high net promoter scores, who therefore have customer lifetime value that exceeds the competition, are worth more. They obtain higher valuations in the private and public market. So it's been a great trend to see over the past 5 or so years of how many of venture capital and private equity firms have adopted the focus on customer experience and in many cases net promoter score.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that, Evan. it's interesting because the board actually drives it more so than the internal drivers at the beginning. And I think that comes from the realization over time that the health of your install base is significantly tied to the overall long-term value of the business. In startups and early stage companies, the focus is on that hockey stick growth curve. But at a point, you get to an inflection point where the value of your install base is much more than the value of what you're driving in new revenue quarter over quarter or year over year. And so preserving that and ensuring that that's not at risk becomes really critical to driving the valuation of the business.
Those are awesome points. Thank you everyone for jumping in on that one. I think getting perspective from each person is awesome. I've got one more question here from James, and I'm going to say what I think he means. And I think he's wanting to know if there are any things that you've seen go awry with NPS. So maybe there's something that your team has done internally or not done internally, in the way that you've followed up or not followed up, things like that that may have impacted how successful your NPS program has been. And I'll leave that one open for the floor if anybody wants to jump in.
I have some thoughts on that. Oh, sorry, Evan.
No, go ahead, Trevor, you first.
So a couple things. One, failure to follow up. There's no point in conducting a survey or having a program like this if you're not going to follow up with the respondents and show them that you're actually listening and actioning the feedback. But more importantly, from looking from an internal head of customer success perspective, focusing on the score. And there's a tendency to focus on the NPS, what was our score, instead of focusing on the progress survey over survey, like Evan was mentioning earlier. It's not about the score, it's actually about the progression and what you're doing to get detractors to passives and passives to promoters, and how you're improving the business and the client sentiment. Survey over survey is much more critical than whatever the NPS score ends up being.
Yeah, no, those are two great recommendations. And what I'll add is there are a lot of pitfalls, frankly. It's a great question because especially net promoter adoption in B2B comes with a lot of nuance that most companies don't appreciate as they venture into implementation. And so we have a lot of content on our site, so I'll refer you there. But one thing that I would offer up as a prominent in addition to what Deborah just offered is the prospect of gaming and artificially inflating your net promoter score. There are a lot of different ways, either intentionally or unintentionally, that companies either skew or inflate their net promoter scores. Again, we have content on our site. It would take us, it's a whole another webinar to talk about the different ways that scores can be gamed. But I would definitely advise keeping an eye out for that and making sure that you mitigate it to the best of your ability.
And then, Erica, I have a couple of other kind of operational pitfalls that we went through. The first is that we used internal language in our survey related to our teams and our product lines. And it turned out that our customers didn't know the names of our teams or our product lines nearly as well as we thought they did. So what was happening is that the customers were ending up giving us scores for products they didn't have, teams they didn't work with. So we really had to simplify it, remove that internal jargon from the communication, and make it really simple for the customer to answer the questions. The second area is we did not do a tremendous job of identifying the key moments of truth or the timing for touch points. And a perfect example of this is we had it scheduled that the first survey would come out at the end of a month, and then it was the 6-month cadence. But for some of our offerings, those customers would still be in implementation after a month. It wasn't finished. So they were receiving that kind of post-implementation survey while they were still in implementation, and that left a kind of negative taste in their mouth. So really understanding your moments of truth, make sure that you're executing in a time-appropriate manner, and then also limiting the amount of internal jargon or terminology that you use in your survey will really help you from kind of an operational perspective.
Awesome. You all have some really good points on these pitfalls. It's maybe not as easy as we think it is. All right, everyone, that concludes our webinar for today. To our panelists, we really appreciate you being here. Your insight is awesome, and we appreciate your time. To all of our attendees, we appreciate your time as well. We hope you'll keep a lookout for the recordings. You can get a refresher, send to your peers, things like that. And that's going to conclude us for today. I hope you all have a great day, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.